well, welcome. I'm Avery Goldstein, Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China here at Penn. And this is an event in the series for the Andrea Mitchell Center for Democracy, but also co-sponsored by our center. And we decided to work together on this because it fit nicely with the theme of this year's program for the Andrea Mitchell Center, but also fits nicely within a topic that is an important theme for anybody who's studying China these days, which is exactly where is Xi Jinping leading the country over the past few years and for who knows how many more years into the future. Today's speaker is one of the, I would say, is kind of a pioneer in this area. One of the first people to really latch on to the idea that Xi Jinping looked like a different sort of leader, and that's going to be reflected in his comments today. So let me begin by telling you something about our speaker. It's Professor Carl Minzner. He's a professor of law at Fordham. He's an expert in Chinese law and governance, got his law degree at Columbia, also has a master's in international affairs from Columbia School of International Public Affairs. Before joining Fordham, he was an associate professor of law at Washington University in St. Louis. And he's also been senior counsel for the Congressional Executive Commission on China, an international affairs fellow for the Council on Foreign Relations, and a Yale China legal education fellow at the Xibei Institute of Politics and Law in Xi'an, China. He's written extensively on China's law and governance in academic journals, including the Journal of Democracy, the Fordham International Law Journal, and the American Journal of Comparative Law. He also publishes in the popular press. He's had op-eds appear in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and Christian Science Monitor. But today he's going to talk about his most recent book from Oxford University Press. He's the author of The End of an Era, How China's Authoritarian Revival is Undermining Its Rise. And before I tell you about the format of today's session, let me tell you that those of you who stick around till the end, there will be free copies of the book, compliments of the author, over there, and until they run out, he's happy to sign them if you would like to have his signature on your book, his autograph. So, here's how we're going to do this. Carl's going to present his ideas, core ideas from the book, and then after that, he's going to have a seat at the table along with a research associate from the Center for the Study of Contemporary China, that many of you know, Neysun Mahboubi, who is also the host of our podcast series with the CSCC. And if you haven't been listening to the podcast, I urge you to go to our website and check out the podcast. New ones have been posted, and in the coming weeks, additional podcasts will be posted. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Carl Minzner to the University of Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Adrian. That was too kind. Thanks so much to Penn, to the Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, and for Avery Center, the Center for the Study of Contemporary China, for putting together today's event. It's a very big honor for me to be speaking to you all today. I've done one or two events in the past, and it's always a great pleasure to be here in Philadelphia. So I'm going to try to give a sort of a big picture overview of the book, and particularly because some in the audience are China specialists, some aren't, I'm going to try to hit both audiences with appropriately. The two-sentence summary of the book is that China's decades-long reform period of Kaifeng is ending. And economically, ideologically, and politically, China is moving into a new post-reform era that differs dramatically from what we've known since the late 1970s. In this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set out the broad overall argument and explain why I'm worried. But I'm going to specifically focus on the political element of the book, because that's, I think, what's generating a lot of the interest right now. And I'm going to explain how China is experiencing erosion of its reform-era political norms and institutions. But of course, to the extent that people want to ask questions in the Q&A section about other aspects, I'm more than happy to take those as well. First, let me start with a brief overview. For the first 3 decades of the People's Republic of China, the Maoist era, China looked like this. Economically, it was stagnant. Pervasive rural poverty and a failed state-run economic model had left the country by 1978 with a per capita GDP lower than that of India or Zaire. Ideologically, China was relatively closed to the outside world. Not only were Western capitalist and Soviet revisionist practices decried, but all religions and Chinese tradition itself were ruthlessly suppressed in the name of socialist modernization. And politically, China was unstable. Power was highly concentrated in a single leader, namely Mao. On the level of elite politics, he had a tendency to purge his designated successors one of whom who died in a beating in a prison cell, the others who perished in a mysterious plane crash in Mongolia while apparently fleeing to the Soviet Union after a failed coup. And within society at large, Mao preferred ruling through disruptive street movements and political campaigns rather than regular institutions of governance, calling citizens out onto the streets to attack his enemies of the day. Communist Party and government institutions themselves dissolved during the decade-long period of chaos known as the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976. For the second 3 decades of the People's Republic of China, what we think of as the period of the Reform era or Chinese Taifang, China looked more like this. Economically, China experienced decades of rapid economic growth. Market reforms launched in the 1980s led China to average 10% GDP growth per year over the next 3 decades. And in the 1980s in particular, this was a broad-based economic growth that lifted all boats, particularly those of the poor, rural poor. Ideologically, China opened up. In Deng Xiaoping's famous words, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. Within the Chinese state and within Chinese schools, that opened up where they gave a whole host of actors wide range of latitude to freely import concepts and practices from abroad. And the party also backed out of people's lives. The ideological fervor that had characterized the Maoist era faded. Religion came back. Muslim mosques and Christian temples, Christian churches reopened. Socialism began to fade into a series of somewhat meaningless slogans that were recited on state television. And privately, as long as you didn't cross that key line of attempting to organize politically, you had a broad degree of freedom to do what you wanted in your private life. And last, politically, China's party leaders supported the emergence of a range of partially institutionalized political norms, in large part to address the chaos and instability that they themselves had experienced under the Maoist era. When I say personal experience, I mean, you got to think about Mao Zedong's son, Deng Bufang, who was thrown off of third story, fifth story, paralyzed, during the Cultural Revolution after being pitched over the, and that's China's top leader in the 80s and 90s. His own son is paralyzed as a result of persecution suffered during the Cultural Revolution. And so when he comes to power in 78, 79, this is the point at which he decides, we've got to do something differently. And so he starts supporting partially institutionalized norms. These are not political liberalization. Rather, what this means is that the rules of the one-party game simply became somewhat more predictable and organized. And so a sampling of these partially institutionalized norms would include things like designation by Deng Xiaoping of his next 2 successors, ensuring an unusual period of elite political stability during the 90s and early 2000s, collective leadership with power split between a range of top party leaders, each having different portfolios that they were responsible for, rather than all power being vested in a single leader, as was the case under Mao. Development of internal norms regarding the regular promotion, retirement, and succession of top party leaders. Partial depoliticization of the bureaucracy, with party leaders retreating from the effort to manage the day-to-day affairs of state, still holding on to overall control, but giving technocrats within the bureaucracy more responsibility for managing the day-to-day affairs of state. And the emergence of bottom-up input institutions, local elections, administrative law channels, and a partially commercialized media airing partial popular grievances that gave citizens a degree of input within the system and contributed to state legitimacy. In short, if we want to think about what this era is marked by, you're thinking about rapid economic growth, a degree of ideological openness, and relative political stability marked by partial political institutionalization. Now we're entering a new period. We can sort of debate a little bit about, all 3 of those things are ending, economically, ideologically, politically. We can debate over the precise dates. That might be a fun discussion with Neysun. Some of the trends actually extend back over a decade, but they've become particularly clear since 2012. So, economically, China is beginning to undergo a seismic shift. Its era of rapid growth is starting to come to an end. Optimists, if you're an optimist, you'll be pointing to secular and demographic shifts that are taking place within China that might lead it to follow the paths of Japan and Taiwan and gradually plateau at a much lower level of growth. If you're a pessimist, on the other hand, You're going to flag a series of what they see as unsustainable pressures in the Chinese economy that they think could lead to a dramatic hard landing, including the buildup in debt levels, which have surged from about 150% of GDP in 2008 to 250, 300% now. But regardless of whether you're an optimist or pessimist, regardless of which of those two viewpoints you take, China is going to be entering an economic period that is dramatically different from what we've known over the past 3 decades. Ideologically, China is gradually turning inwards on itself again. This is showing up in society. So a renewed popular interest in Confucianism, a proliferation of these faux Han Dynasty clothing for college graduation ceremonies. But it's also showing up in state actions, such as Xi Jinping's 2013 visit to Qufu, the birthplace of Confucius, and his declarations that the Communist Party, after having spent the better part of the 20th century trying to eliminate or wipe out traditional Chinese beliefs and religions, now needs to embrace them and fuse them with nationalism and Marxist-Leninism into state ideology. Now, of course, part of this is an entirely is a renewed interest on the part of citizens in their own culture, and this is just a totally natural process. Many people in China are beginning to quite understandably question, now that China has arisen, shouldn't we perhaps take more of an interest in our own culture and our own traditions than simply absorbing practices from or cultural products from overseas, as was the case in the 80s and 90s. But it's also important to recognize that another element of what is taking place is a strategic effort on the part of China's new leaders to attempt to deploy Chinese tradition, as an ideological shield against foreign values, particularly Western ones. There's a sense among those in the party propaganda apparatus and others higher in the system that the collapse of communism as an ideology has left a spiritual and a moral void within China that has permitted a whole range of foreign ideologies, ranging from underground Christian house churches to Western liberal beliefs to Islamic influences from overseas, to infiltrate and undermine China. Now, if you're a party propaganda, you think, well, how are we going to deal with that? Now, of course, some within the bureaucracy are attempting to double down on Marxism. So you had the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth last year, and the party leaders made a big push on that front, requiring officials to read the Communist Manifesto and that. But there's a problem with that. Party leaders today aren't interested in class revolution. They really don't want Jiejidojo. It isn't interested in the migrant workers in Beijing rising up. The real irony in China today is that the worst fears of the Chinese communist leaders is that there may actually be a labor leader out there somewhere that would be involved in organizing the discontented members of the proletariat to take action. And that's precisely why you see Chinese officials move aggressively in the past few months to crack down on Marxist student groups in Chinese colleges that started to take some of those required readings a little too seriously and began to try to link up with some of those socially discontented workers in society, namely groups of disaffected blue-collar workers. So Chinese party leaders remember their own history, and they're determined not to let anybody else repeat it. So if you're faced with that as an ideological conundrum, you got to be like, well, what else do we do? And this pivot back to tradition is, I think, one of the key moves that party leaders are attempting to do. They're attempting to redefine the Chinese Communist Party in the vein of Chinese tradition, and paint it as the logical successor to China's past imperial glories. And so you've seen that means clearly reasserting China's own distinct cultural and historical identity. You've seen that with a very clear rollout of central efforts to politically rectify academia and textbooks to purge Western ideas. And if you're trying to think about this, for those of you who don't know China, think of it as a Make China Great Again campaign with nativist donors. So then you'd be like, oh, the Americans they sort of understand what's going on. Now there is one other thing to pay attention on the ideological front, which is when you assert a more clear and closed narrative of what it means to be Chinese, it has another effect. It amplifies tensions with those people in China who fit least well into that narrative. So, for example, when you try to push patriotic education, Beijing tries to put patriotic education in the Hong Kong schools, Cantonese-speaking area with a distinct history that's different from, you start to push that in Hong Kong, you begin to see the birth of the student organizations that give rise to the Occupy Central protests in fall 2014. That's why when you see Beijing begin to try to push more dramatically against religious practices and the cultural identity of the Uyghur minority groups in northwest China, you start to see that fuel Islamic radicalization. And similarly with Christian churches, when you begin to sort of begin to re-emphasize China, you take more of a look at Islam and Christianity in a different way, and you start to amplify tensions with Christian believers. None of these are imminent threats to Chinese stability. Each of these communities is a couple tens of millions of people here and there, but they're an indication how things are beginning to shift, even just compared to 10 or 15 years ago within China. Now, let me move away from the ideological element and look at the political dimension, because this is, I think, one of the things that's getting most interest right now. Politically, what you're seeing is a breakdown in what we thought were established elite norms and practices. Since Xi Jinping's rise in 2012, he's broken with many of those tacit or partially institutionalized norms that I mentioned, which were established in the early reform era. The fall of former security czar Zhou Yongkang in 2013 marked the breakdown of tacit norms against targeting top-level leaders who had served in the Politburo Standing Committee and their families after they had left office. Similarly, a range of ill-defined Lingdao-cells, or these leadership groups, over the economy, over national security, have been formed that have reconcentrated power in the hands of that had previously been divided among other top members within China, reconcentrated that in the hands of Xi Jinping himself. And long-standing aversion to anything resembling a cult of personality, which again was one of, you're thinking of Deng Xiaoping, you're thinking of the turn away from Maoist practices. There had been this aversion to anything remotely resembling the cult of personality, and that's beginning to give way as you start to see much more attention in the state media focused on Xi Jinping himself to the exclusion of other top leaders. Within the past 2 years, it's a Maoist cult, it's a whiff of a cult of personality, but it's different from what you've seen before. Within the past 2 years, you've seen other norms fall as well. In the fall of 2017, at the 19th Party Congress, party leaders broke with tradition and avoided naming a clear successor to Xi Jinping as he entered his theoretically final 5-year term as party general secretary. And in the spring of 2018, last year, party leaders moved to amend the Chinese constitution to erase the term limits on Xi Jinping's role, state government role, as China's president. Both of these moves pave the way for Xi Jinping to serve as the head of both the party, the state, and the military for decades into the future. It opens up that door. And of course, if that happens, that represents the likely rejection of yet another core reform-era norm and a political potential reversion to the kind of long-term single-man authoritarian rule which had characterized the pre-reform era. Now I'm going to flag quickly, or I'm going to flag 2 other important shifts. These are the ones you sort of will hear about in the media and the like. But let me flag 2 that I think haven't gotten as much attention and are really crucial. The first shift which is taking place is something that's taking place within the mid-level and the lower level of the Chinese state. And the way I would describe this is the repartyization of the Chinese bureaucracy. Remember that the early reform era had seen the party back out of the day-to-day management of state affairs. That's now eroding as well. If you look at the constitutional amendments in the spring of 2018 that created a National Supervisory Commission, that effectively takes the party's internal disciplinary organ, remodels it in new form, and gives it a scope, an ability to go after. Previously, that body had only been party disciplinary body, had only been authorized to go after party members. You remodel it as a National Supervisory Commission, and you charge it with going after anybody who receives a state salary. And so that's broader than just party officials. That includes anyone receiving a state salary, SOE employees, university professors, and a much wider range of folks. And that could potentially allow the black box norms that had existed within the party disciplinary system to begin to spread much more widely within the state bureaucracy. Or similarly, look at the government reorganization plan which took place last year as well. That eliminates a whole host of government organs and merges them with party ones. So the state civil service commission gets folded into the party organization bureau. The state administration of religious affairs gets merged with the party's United Front work department, etc. Now you can say on the one hand, this politics doesn't really matter. Those party guys are always running the show, behind it. They make the big decisions. But on the other hand, it really does matter, because what you're doing is you're putting the party cadres much more directly in the driving seat of day-to-day operations. And so it's also not limited to state organs. For those of you who follow business affairs, you're seeing similar trends with foreign and Chinese firms. There's a new emphasis on sort of getting the party authorities into foreign, resuscitating the party cells that existed within businesses, and try to give them a greater degree of voice in, say, personnel decisions. Collectively, these things are precisely how this partial distinction between party and state that had built up over the Reform era start to get erased, and power starts to collapse into a much tighter unity. Okay, the second thing I'm going to flag is the intensification of repression in China's western region of Xinjiang, heavily populated by a Muslim ethnic minority, namely the Uyghurs. This has now started to begin over the last couple months, get much more attention. Now, of course, concerns over ethnic unrest and border security have meant that Beijing always wielded a tighter hand in Xinjiang, and which was stepped up already, notably in 2009, after a major bout of intra-ethnic rioting, which has led to the death of both Han and Uyghur alike. But since 2017, there's been another qualitative shift. Specifically, Beijing's constructed a web of political re-education camps in which a significant percentage of the Uyghur population, estimates range from a couple hundred of thousands to upwards of 1 million people, have been preemptively disappeared. And state efforts to sort of really eradicate the identity and religion of Uyghurs have been escalating. So party cadres being dropped into homes for homestays to kind of monitor what people are doing at home, shuttering mosques and the like. And of course, in and of itself, this is a major human rights issue, one which is now beginning to get major attention. But I think to tie it back into these things, I think it's also important to realize that this is also a real break with another crucial Reform era norm. Let me explain this. In pre-Reform China, Maoist China, society was extensively politicized. Broad swaths of people were labeled bad class backgrounds or overseas family ties. And your label was linked to persecution or denial of benefits, such as your ability to go to college. Now, that more or less came to an end with the birth of the Reform era. Beijing still came down like a hammer on individual dissidents or people who were doing things like trying to organize labor organizations. But that broad use of labeling to sort of label swaths of society and mobilize, landless peasants against people with, with former landlord backgrounds, that kind of dropped off the stage. What worries me about what's going on in Xinjiang is I can start to see how this type of social politicization gets revived. And some of those cracks that exist, because China has lots of different things going on. But you can imagine those social cracks start getting mobilized, manipulated again. So reports suggest that some of those practices in Xinjiang are beginning to migrate out of Xinjiang into provinces like Gansu and Ningxia that have heavily Muslim but not Uyghur populations, way Muslim populations. And once you start to see that, it's really easy to see how some within the party bureaucracy, either directly or indirectly, might start to adopt some of that same mentality, if not necessarily the same practices, to other groups within society, say the large Christian population. And then once you start thinking about that, you can really start to spin from there. For those of you who sort of read, WeChat, you really should take a look at the term is the there's weird stuff going on in the Chinese internet with respect to the way Muslims are being countered, and that's not all state. Some of it's just bubbling up in society, and you can think about how that gets spun. Anyway, in summary, China is ideologically closing up, it's economically slowing down, and the partially institutionalized political norms of the past several decades are starting to buckle. So, one of the questions is, why is all this happening? Why are these political norms coming undone? And we can go into this more in the Q&A, but I think the core answer is because of China's failure to build alternative institutions during the Reform era, arising from this dogged adherence to one-party rule, Xi Jinping now finds himself driven back to yet older methods to make change happen. And the way I like to think of it is put yourself in Xi Jinping's shoes in circa 2012. you are a committed believer in the party's continued political dominance. You sense China slouching towards crisis. As you come to power in 2012, you see a frozen and factionalized party political system within the party itself. You see corruption beginning to seep within the bones of the Chinese party itself. You viscerally reject any move towards political liberalization precisely because that's been off the table since 1989, and you will certainly remember what happened with the Soviet Union. They're not going in that direction. So what do? You kind of do what he does, which is you resort to the levers that you do have. You try to centralize power in your own hands, launch politicized purges of your rivals, cultivate a populist image among the masses, and promote an ideological shift back to nationalism and cultural identity. I don't like it, but I mean, if you're thinking the logic of what's going on, there's a logic to why he's doing what he's doing. Now, what does this all mean? Some observers have argued that this means she is a new Mao. I don't go that far. There are still some key reform era norms that have not yet been broken. The big one being any resort to bottom-up social mobilization, i.e. the mass movements that characterize the Mao. The Mao era, you would be calling people out on the streets to attack group. Everything that's happening right now is top-down. So there's a crucial norm that has not been broken yet. But the key point is that the reform era itself is unwinding. And once you conclude that the political rules of the game that governed the past couple of decades are coming undone, the real operative question is, well, which are the next ones that will come undone? And again, now we try to loop it in for sort of the non-China specialists. But just to be clear, while the story above is a China-specific story of political erosion within China's Leninist one-party state, I'm not actually bashing China. The idea that political norms are breaking down has parallels even in democratic societies. Look at Turkey, look at India, look at the Philippines, look at the United States. In fact, if I was a United States expert, I might try to tell a story. Maybe I'd keep the title of my book the same. I might try to tell a story where the last 2 decades of the 20th century gave rise to a fusion of money and party politics that's led to a steady erosion of American political institutions and norms by the early 21st century. Existing norms began to give way. Bipartisan compromise, Senate rules regarding the use of the filibuster, not shutting the government down for weeks on end. Core leaders began to experiment with ways to make an end run around existing institutions viewed as problematic and attempted to concentrate power in their own hands, by declaring a national emergency. There was American ideology closed down. There was a turn against immigration and free trade. There was a slide towards alternative mechanisms of governance, direct communication over Twitter, the use of vaguely defined leadership groups, the cult of personality over experience, purges of the heads of the domestic security services, the FBI, the diplomatic corps, and I could keep going on and on. Of course, there are crucial differences. In China, what is taking place is top-down political erosion driven by Xi Jinping and those around him. Well, what is taking place in the United States and some other Western societies, at least in my view, is bottom-up political erosion fueled by populist pressures on both the left and the right. But make no mistake, the risks of what are taking place in China are just as severe, if not more so, than what's taking place in the United States. Because if you're like me, if you're worried what's taking place here, the trends you see in the United States, I think you have to ask yourself, what happens when you see that kind of political erosion take place in a country like China, where the entire institutional political architecture is of much more recent vintage, and where the history of really severe political turbulence, the Maoist era, is much more recent. And that's why I think what is happening right now is so risky. Because in some ways, Chinese politics is like Jenga. Once you start pulling these things apart, it's not just like you start pulling one thing apart, and the underlying problems that plagued the pre-reform era start pushing themselves zombie-like back to the surface again. So local officials competing to exalt the top leader, breakdown of top channels of information to the top of the system as people become increasingly unwilling to reflect back negative information. Efforts to spread party controls back into areas where they've retreated from in the past, such as culture and academia, which is taking place right now. An erosion in the technocratic capacities of the state, and much more vicious internal score settling within the party elite as norms continue to break down. And I think for that, those of you who follow Chinese politics, we want to be looking at both some of the official language that was used to target Bo Xilai, Zhou Yongkang, and Sun Zhengzai of plotting a coup. And you also want to be looking at things like the recent announcement that China's new National Supervisory Commission, which now can go much deeper, is going to go after, it's increasing its political inspections and go after political deviation, not just within the party, but within the government apparatus as well. And all of that spells trouble. I think in the short term it bodes for a more hardline, personalized authoritarian state. But in the longer term, I think it's a recipe for the revival of the kind of internal political instability that many observers have thought was dead and buried since the beginning of the reform era. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with Neysun and taking a few questions. If any of you do happen to buy the book, write reviews. I was voting. Negative, positive. I'd love to hear any. So thank you so much.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to continue a conversation with Carl that began in the fall of 1998 when I entered Columbia Law School and met a 2L at the time. So I guess that makes him my Schurzjung, right? And we have had a chance personally to discuss legal issues in particular for many years, but also some of the broader questions that you raised in this book and your talk. A couple of years ago, we had a public dialogue at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China, and then we followed up with another dialogue at Fordham Law School, which ended up getting published in Chinophile. And so I'm glad to keep the conversation going. One thing that I very much appreciated about this project was that as someone who comes from my world, a law scholar who's written very, very detailed, and as you note in the book, very well cited, precisely cited legal academic work, you're very consciously trying to reach a broader audience and to reach broader themes in this book. And I think it's really admirable for those of us in disciplines to try to speak to other disciplines studying China and then to speak to wider audiences. But that's where I want to start off with a question for you. To maybe explain your methodology in seeing these big trends. What are you looking at specifically that you're drawing your conclusions from? And then within that, I wanted to ask you the question about time periods. There is a sense in which we're accustomed to thinking of modern Chinese history in these segments, and to see particular things as being associated with those segments. But as we have discussed, many things are happening at any given time, and rooting them in any particular segment can be tricky. So for example, right now there's a lot of discussion of the Belt and Road Initiative. And you'll see in the academic work, there's some people who say this is Xi Jinping. This is all started with Xi Jinping. And then other people say, no, actually the Belt and Road Initiative started with Hu Jintao. And then other people say, no, the Belt and Road Initiative started with Deng Xiaoping. So at any given moment, there are the seeds of different things. In your own work, your very famous article on China's turn against law talked about some of the ways in which, under the Hu Jintao administration, the legal system was moving in directions away from formal adjudication and towards more mediation processes. But one of the pushbacks was, well, some of these things started under the previous administration. How do you determine at any given moment what is the major trend, even though we might acknowledge that every trend has its roots in other periods of time?
That's an excellent question. And now, Neysun was being too kind in talking about the earlier work. I mean, essentially what he's saying is nobody reads the stuff. But, the number of people who sort of do Chinese law is like maybe 4 or 5. So, other stuff, people don't, you're going to read what's in here. So part of this is me trying to look at a sort of broader set of issues and write something that people would actually read if you're not happening to be like China law, like Neysun and myself. So first with respect to the periodization, because I think that's an important thing. So, thinking, basically what I'm trying to grapple with here is where is China going? What is it taking? What direction? Is that period? Is there something new that's happening? Is there something different? How should we think about it? And then this is going to get into the time frame element too. And I think in attempting to think through that, I thought the first thing I did was I wanted to flip back to what I do think people recognize as two different time periods: the Maoist period and the Reform period. I think more or less, when whether you regard to a history person or a that period in 78, 79, 80, that is a crucial break. And so I think probably foreign people who do foreign relations, they'll have their own narrative. I focus on domestic politics. But I do think that one way or the other, that's regarded as a crucial break. And so in part of thinking about this, one element is I wanted to go back and what do we think were the key shifts for saying what's pre-78, post-78, what's the difference? And I felt like, economics, ideology, and politics were the two areas. And so I just sat down and I said, okay, what are the characteristics that determine that difference? And then, once you think about that, then you just have to apply that same rubric to now. What's different? And once I start doing that comparison, I'm like, and this is where you get into the time frame thing, but that we really are, China is not in the same place as, and I know maybe for some of you on the outside, you think, well, this is so, if you work on Germany or Europe, you're like, that's kind of, but you got to recognize that for those of us who do the China sphere, this is it's a tricky area because one of the things that I think is always in the background, people are, well, it's not the Cultural Revolution, so it's always the same. But that's not really, if you're always saying it's not the Cultural Revolution, that kind of deprives you of the ability to sort of draw any important differences. And so part of me was just saying, what's different post-78, pre-78, and then I need to apply that same, and if you look at economics, if you look at ideology, and if you look at the breakdown of political norms, I felt like it was, this was already totally opposite. And the other defense on this, I will say, is, I came up with that title, and I was like, oh, Lord, what are they going to say? And then Xi Jinping goes ahead and says, Xin Shidai, new era. So right as he begins to proclaim, he gets his ideological mantra inserted into the party charter. What does he use? It's, the thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for, and Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And then I'm like, well, look, it's not me anymore. It's Xi Jinping has proclaimed there's a new era. I'm like, and that's my other defense. It's like, well, look, I'm just repeating what Xi Jinping's saying now. So that's on the methodological side, that would be my defense. Your question about the time frame, I think, is a good one. 1978 is a really easy break in some ways because it's such a sharp difference. What's taking place here, I think, is more of a slow moving. So on the economic front, it's not like there's a cliff, but it's like you're moving into a new period. The ideological shifts, I think they're just getting more and more clear over time. I mean, the accretion of them. And then, exactly what's happening with, Xi Jinping, we're seeing something that's happening now in 2007, 2017, 2018. But I also view some of that as logically following from some stuff that was happening even in the late June Tower. So in fact, I do think some of the trends that I was looking at with respect to the Zhengfang, or the political legal portfolio in some of those earlier work, I think back in 2010, 2011, I could say, well, this is the growth of the Weiwen apparatus, some of the trends that are taking place there, the internal domestic social stability apparatus, that's at least happened to the political legal, doesn't affect anything else. But now I'm kind of seeing that all of those trends are now beginning to spread into other areas, and so it's just becoming more clear. But it's a fair, and look, the intensification of oppression against domestic activists, that goes back to those rights lawyers as of 2005 are starting to feel increased heat, and it's just an escalation. So I resist the idea that 2012 is as clear a barrier or clear a line as 1978. But I do think it's important, if you're trying to tell that narrative, you want to identify some clear line posting. But whatever it is, something shifted in that period early, over the last 15 years or so, and I'm trying to point to that general area. Now we're in something different.
Just to pick up for a moment on the part where you mentioned that in the late Hu Jintao period, you were seeing this new trend in the political legal sphere, but it wasn't broader. I went back and I looked at our China file dialogue, and one thing that stuck out to me was that you were then, and that was published in 2016, so the conversation was in 2015. You were
2012, legal education.
our conversation.
Our conversation.
But in that conversation, you were open to the point that I was making that in the legal sphere, there had been some developments under Xi Jinping that actually, in the first period of 2013-2014, seemed to be going back against the turn against law that you documented in the late Hu Jintao period. And in our exchange about that, something you noted was that when you looked at it in the late Hu Jintao period, you saw it cabined in this area, but then later you're seeing it spread, where you also were open to the idea that actually in law, there was a return to formal legal mechanisms. And the question you raised at the end of that dialogue was, but how long can this last if the overall political context is becoming more and more toxic? So now, 3 years later, what happened? Do you think that the overall political context has overwhelmed whatever was happening in the legal sphere?
Right. So first, that's in the book. Actually, I totally agree on that. That's framed in the book too. And right. So because what you're seeing right now in China, large, China complex, China not a monolith, you are seeing different things happening. But there is a sea change, and gradually certain things are getting overwhelmed. But I agree that those, there's some really interesting people in the Chinese judiciary. I think they're still out there. There's some things that turn towards professionalism. Xi Jinping's use of both, it kind of fits in with what he wants to do with both the party and with the judiciary at large. So it's a pocket of institutional controls. So that's still out there, but I completely think that the pressure is building, the waves, the sea level is rising, and that stuff will get overwhelmed. I think if you want to look at one other way you can start to see this, look at all your friends in Chinese academia who work on law stuff, and look, kind of the pressure that's starting to come down on the people who weren't the legal activists. 2008 or so, the groups who were public interest lawyers who were doing stuff are under pressure. But the dudes who are sitting in the college campuses and just writing or talking, it's still like, okay, that's the party control hasn't gone. Now that's where the pressure is starting. That's where they're coming back into the schools, and I look at that trend, and it just feels to me like you can see this building, and I can't spell that. Okay, there's still some threads out there in the court area that are interesting, etc. But I can't spell that into that survives the stuff that I'm starting to see develop.
So let's say we accept the main thrust of your argument, and I saw that Reuters had that piece this morning about how the Central Commission on Fiscal Inspection is now going to look after political deviation. So that, I think, is another thing that strengthens your position. Let me get you on the other side. Why hasn't it gone further? Something that you made clear in the book, and you also made in your presentation, was that not all the norms have been set aside. And there are some very important bulwarks, including that Xi Jinping has not mobilized the population the way that Mao did, but also that ideology is still a little fuzzy. There's still some of the old Marxist dialectic stuff. It isn't like 100% clear that the ideology is completely shifted. On the back end, what explains that these trends haven't gone further?
That's, I think, an excellent question. So two things. One, I do think there's resistance within the party and state. I mean, even if you're not, the people at the top of the party themselves, I don't think there are people who are sort of committed to sort of what you think political liberalization. But I do think there are people who recognize that if you vest all the power in the hands of one person, that can really not be a good thing for the other people. And so I think this pressure, people who do American politics, this is a more institutionalized system. You can sort of see on the surface the pushback that happens through the courts, the legislatures, and stuff. That, in a less institutionalized system like China, you may, and we're closed, you don't necessarily see the pushback, but it's there. It's people like, well, we're going to authorize this campaign, we really want this new commission to sort of work in this way. That kind of stuff, that kind of tension is out there. And so I think that's, she is able to do some things, but there is resistance to others. There are latent norms, there's latent pushback. So that's one. I do think the other element is it's harder to, on the bottom-up mobilization. Chinese society is different now than before. The reform era, society, politics, in the pre-78 era, politics was everything. Chinese society was a highly mobilized one. You could stir people to do things. After 78, it became much more inert. The focus of many people was on, making money. So reviving or getting that kind of whipping up people is not as easy. Not as easy doesn't mean impossible. And so I think, you shouldn't take so much comfort from the idea, well, it hasn't happened, because I would say it hasn't happened yet. Any society, and again, for those of you who look at, other societies that have begun to undergo erosion in the democratic form of their norms, it is possible where you start to see groups or concepts that previously couldn't imagine norms or societal taboos against X, they start to give way. That can happen in China as well. It will happen in slightly different ways because it's a one-party system and things, you're not just to see the way the games that are played, but it can happen. And some of that stuff that's going on the internet right now around Muslims, I would be watching that stuff because that can go really, there's third-rate stuff out there.
So you said two things that I want to follow up on. The first gives me an opening to ask probably my favorite question that I thought I wanted to ask you, which is this. When you think about Xi Jinping facing bureaucratic resistance, that's a point you just made, it's also in the book, and some of the accounts of Xi Jinping that are more charitable emphasize that point, that Xi Jinping needs to solve these big policy problems and there's this bureaucratic inertia that he has to somehow break. And then I just started hearing Donald Trump and the deep state, and I wonder if you think there's any parallels between how certain people in the US, including our president, have talked about the bureaucracy and the way in which, on this account at least, the bureaucracy, Chinese bureaucracy, is an impediment to what Xi Jinping may be trying to accomplish.
So I certainly think that, there's interesting parallels. I think one of them is the idea of if you're trying to push change in a large system, you are looking for ways in which you want to break through resistance. You're looking for ways in which you can break through existing institutions. And in China, those are those partially institutionalized norms. You view, the Zhou Yongkang and the separation of power that kind of emerged in the late, Zhou Yongkang has a security turf that you don't necessarily control. You're a little worried about that being used against you. You've got to figure out ways to eradicate, get rid of him. And it's his rise. You gotta look at that. Bo Xilai goes down first, then Zhou Yongkang, then the military guys. It's a very step-by-step, he's convincing people, it was the problem, we're just gonna take him down. Then it's just Zhou Yongkang I don't have any inside information, but I can see that as a very savvy, bureaucratic tactic. By the later period, you and Zhang and Hu Jintao are possibly beginning to push back a little bit, it's going, you've already marginalized their power bases to such an extent that, it's not like, but you think at the beginning when he was taking down Bo, everyone thought, well, this is going to go as far as it was. No, it's very savvy. So you're looking for ways in which you can break through institutional resistance. And, the corruption campaign, part of it is also, I'm more worried about corruption in the party, but you're introducing a level of instability within the system, which is useful when you're trying to break through the networks and you're trying to consolidate your own power. So I think some of the narratives when people think about Xi Jinping, they think about, is he a good guy or a bad guy? I think that kind of gets, I think you gotta recognize, so what if you were him, once you start doing this, anything starts to look as a threat to your power. So, I even have to believe that, he's actually just trying to, I'm worried about the party, I'm worried about the purity, and trying to get rid of corruption within it. It's almost like the game that's being played starts to push you in particular directions, and it leads you down that path. And so, what worries me about China is I can just see how this continually begins to grow. Once you start to worry about, where the public interest lawyers are getting their ideas and their ideological support from, you start looking at the schools. You start looking at the schools, you're like, what are people learning there? Maybe we need to start to engage in a more thoroughgoing rectification of education. There's this dynamic the rolling starts, and I'm looking for what's going to stop it. And in China, I can't tell how that what the stopping point is, and that's what worries me.
The second thread that I wanted to pick up that I think maybe connects with what you just said is that, your talk is in this series sponsored by the Mitchell Center on authoritarian trends throughout the world and maybe democratic erosion throughout the world. And as we all know, in many countries, those trends are in many ways rooted in popular sentiment and in rightward trends among populations, whether they be in the United States or in Europe or Latin America. What's the role of the Chinese people in this particular story that you're telling about China?
I think that's an excellent question. And actually, at the moment, precisely that's what I'm saying. One of the final taboos is the mobilization you haven't gotten that yet. At the moment, it's really much something that's taking place within the party. The people are sort of standing, the masses are kind of standing. Doesn't mean that you don't have pressures. You've got discontent. You've got people who have, migrant workers who lack blue collar in major cities, and they're kind of, beginning the residence permits and the benefits. There are tensions within the Chinese, within the people that are out there. And what worries me is, I sort of feel like this is the iceberg. We're like looking at kind of like the tip of this, but all the stuff that's within the system at some point is also tied within the society as well. And so as this stuff begins to progress, it's going to start to implicate more and more things, and that's what really worries me. But at the moment, I think that's a key difference between what you're seeing in China. There's an erosion that's taking place within the system, but it still hasn't fully percolated out into society.
Although Xi Jinping seems, and it's very hard to tell because we don't have real mechanisms of polling. Right. But there is some basis that you mentioned in the book to suggest that Xi Jinping is popular in some ways precisely for the perception that he's going after corrupt officials.
Yes, and I think that's his positioning in something. So I don't discount that as that's support. I think that is, in some ways, Donald Trump, you attack the institutions. You sort of say that the best institutions of the last 30 or 40 years have not been benefiting you. I portray myself as siding on your side. I think there's an element of what Xi Jinping is doing in that way that actually does mean he has to. This is not a story of somebody who is completely unaware of the way the party is perceived. This is not an isolated individual who's out of touch. He is drawing, if you look at some of the Chinese New Year, his populist appeals, he knows how to sort of get popular. And I think that also registers in terms of making the system pliable, because people, if you're a mid-level career bureaucrat, I think at some point you kind of, in the back of your mind, like, what could be used against me, and so that makes you maybe more willing to. Anyway, yes, I think that is in the background, but it hasn't. Don't think this is not. You don't have the throngs of people in the auditoriums, yet. So that's a big difference. Not in laughter.
So let me ask you one last question before we open it up to this terrific audience that's assembled today. And so I was thinking back. I was in Beijing in December, visiting law school there, and a moment that really stuck in my mind was speaking to a senior faculty member for whom I have a lot of respect. And after a number of weeks of hearing, within the university setting, a lot of sort of concern about trends that were happening. And I'll never forget, it was the afternoon. I'll try to paint a picture for you. It's, afternoon sunlight is coming into his office. And I say, well, what do you think? Do you see the retrenchment? Do you see this going back towards the direction of the Cultural Revolution, all those things? And he said, look, the window is open. Once you've opened the window, you can't stop the sunlight from coming in. Which, may be sort of something that made me feel good, but I think there is some basis for thinking that the processes that have been set in motion by the reform and opening period, including students coming to the United States and new avenues of information, ultimately will be hard to combat. And what I thought was very interesting in reading the book was that I actually think there is a similar hopeful strain. It isn't the main theme of the book, but there is a strain in the book where you're not saying that these are irreversible trends. And in fact, I think you can anticipate in the book that the future may see cutting back against this So I want to just have my intervention here close with asking you more about that. Do you think that the fundamental processes are strong enough to push back eventually, or is something else needed to push back against the trends that you see?
I mean, how to phrase this? I mean, I think there is pressure on many different sides within China for different things. You have different social groupings that want different stuff. You have migrant workers who want a place in Shanghai. You want wealthy individuals who sort of don't want the migrant workers' children in their, you've got different groups. China has as much tension as any other society. I think one of the real questions for the long term, this is, this audience, people in this audience are going to be involved in this, is where does all that tension go? The story that I could tell over the course of the reform era was that there were institutions, and the legal ones that you and I studied were one of them, in which this pressure was being funneled into building new institutions to begin to grapple with those. That is an organic evolution by which you could start to see these. Put that political, democratization. Just think about what are the institutions that get built, and do they have legitimacy? Can they help the poor? That's what China needs right now. And I could tell a story over the reform era that stuff, was getting built, and it's harder and harder for me to tell that story. Now, if you wanted me to close on a hopeful note, that's the direction somehow that happens. But I just feel like it's progressively, like I'm just seeing little windows that get closed one after another. And once I start seeing that windows close, I can see how those tensions, if I start flipping back into that stuff, can blow up in a range of different ways. And that's the fearsome scenario.
So not a hopeful note.
Well, I like to see 90, I'm 90% negative, 10% positive. I like to hold out a little bit of hope there. But look, this is different. 2003, I was 50-50 on direction. In China now, I just feel like the trajectory we're is going all the wrong direction. And it's not just random stuff in the legal system. No, it's politics, ideology, and economics. All this is happening before China even has a major. What do you think is going to happen if China has a major economic? Anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay, so we have a lot here, and a lot of people, so we have because we want to reserve some time for Carl's Science and books, we're going to take about 20-25 minutes at the most of questions. And just the floor is yours. Please just try to make the questions and shorter so we can get as many voices as possible. Do you want to take your own cue, or do you want me to take it? Okay.
Hi, thank you for your great talk. My question is, what do you see? Hi, thank you for your great talk. My question is, what do you see the role of online censorship and in real life censorship in molding or affecting the events of the last 2 years? And then, of course, it goes back before that.
Sure.
Let me build on the last question. You mentioned weird stuff going on the internet, and it is notable that nationalism and the social Darwinism and the stigmatization of minorities happening on the Chinese internet, like Muslims are painted as minority ethnics trying to seek privileges, Uyghurs as terrorists hostile to Han, feminists as a Muslim conspiracy, gay men as like tricking innocent women into marriage and those stuff. Do you believe that what's happening in the politics is a reaction to the public opinion, or do you believe the public opinion is directed by the government through censorship and propaganda? Thank you.
Why don't we make this the internet group of questions? Does anyone else have an internet-related question? That's an internet-related question, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So you mentioned nationalism and a trend worldwide, and I was wondering if anyone is thinking about the possibility that stolen data from the internet could be used and manipulated by non-state or state actors globally to influence what information is available to world leaders and those that work and closely with them. And by which I mean, we're seeing the disintegration of many institutions and much disagreement and much misunderstanding as well as the rise of the revelation of improprieties. And I'm wondering if some sort of information, considering the fact that there are so many militaries and agencies and businesses worldwide that have access to our emails and other habits, satellites, etc., a mass gathering of this data could be enlightening. There is talk about a deep state, for example, in the US, for example, some sort of unseen yet unacknowledged body. And I'm thinking of ransomware, for example, and actors such as those. So if you can, you're sort of hearing what I'm saying.
I'll take these three. Okay, that's a good question on that one.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting one.
So in sort of trying to manipulate China, for example, the U.S. or Hungary.
So we should, just because of time, we should.
Okay, I sort of see where you're going. So I think that's actually, you're absolutely right. That's one of the things you're seeing both with the United, with a range of countries is sort of that mass gathering of information about, stuff. And look, I don't think it's not like the United States is doing that as well. But you're exactly right that sort of China and Russia, also vacuuming up large amount of information. The China, half of the GAO sort of picking up a huge amount of information of U.S. government employees and like. So yes, I think that's probably something that's happening on a wide scale around the world. One of the interesting differences, as far as I understand, between China and Russia is Russia's been much more active about attempting to use that in terms of manipulating opinion within sort of the broader political body of the U.S. generally. In contrast, so far what I've seen with respect to China is they're interested in the diaspora. They're interested at the moment, it's not to say that they're not sucking up information, but the main focus at the moment is really on ethnic Chinese media and ethnic Chinese students, Chinese communities overseas. Now maybe at some point that changes, but at the moment I see them, I think the Chinese governments, they're tactically using it because they're trying to unmask CIA agents within their midst and so forth, but the step of really mobilizing Russia level stuff, I haven't fully seen China doing that yet. Maybe it'll change in the future. That'll lead to the, you also mentioned sort of the breakdown of institutions, sort of immediate institutions, and I can use that to loop into the two other questions with respect to the internet. I think you guys, the questions you raised are kind of interrelated. If I was going to tell the media story with respect to sort of the late 90s and early 2000s in China, it would be something like this, which was the reform-era retreat of the state from trying to control everything, left open a partially commercialized media, or Nanfang Zhongmo, the Southern China Weekend, some internet blogging sites that were sort of a little bit less controlled, and you started to have the emergence of a wider spectrum of voices, and this included stuff that was both within the state but without the state as well, and you started to get a range of different organs out there that developed. You could have imagined a world in which that would produce Chinese media institutions which were respected, which people trusted, that engaged in good journalism, self-checking stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And look, I was reading the Nanfang Zhongmo in 2000. Some of their reports in 2000, there was really good stuff in there, and these are really crack Chinese journalists. When the shift begins to happen, when the party decides we need to get more of a control of those things start to go dark. Party censorship gets more intense. Weibo has its moment, 2008, 2009, when the clamps come in there. What you start to see is those things close down, and there are two effects of that. One, you start to lose that group of, or the seeds of trusted media voices. And of course, then you're left with People's Daily, you're left with Xinhua. But that doesn't mean that those other, the desire to vocalize stuff is out there. It just goes in different directions. It goes dark. It goes like the weird things, small WeChat groups where people are like, well, it's all about the Muslims doing blah, blah, blah. And Song Wafa will sort of cure all of it. I mean, you get the, pine needle politics. I mean, you get weird things that just kind of percolate out there, precisely because the venues are, party propaganda and then just kind of all this other stuff. And so you don't have the trust, what do you believe, what's real, kind of vaporizes. And for those of you in the States, you can kind of see this. You think about weird things that you see out there in various media, as the media disassociation starts to happen in the States, you can see it out here too. But just imagine it's escalated even further because you don't have all of those names of real journalists. That's just completely out and not gone. And then your question was, is it state directed or is it, and it's a mix. Because on the one hand, it's just, just like in the States, you've got different people thinking different things, and the party leaders then find them in a position of tacitly, encouraging or not encouraging. And just to take that example, since we were talking about the Muslim stuff, it's kind of like, well, what do you do? I mean, you got the guys who sort of think, halal or the Muslim dietary food stuff is contrary to China's essence. They sound nationalistic and they kind of are pro-party and they're attacking the liberal groups that you're kind of a little bit more worried about. So maybe you don't censor their stuff, and you get this weird back and forth. Look, just imagine that Trump had control over Fox News and he was starting to imagine he had more greater media control and was able to start shutting down the New York Times and stuff. And then you can start to imagine how some of that stuff on Breitbart begins to sort of feed much. Anyway, it's too much of an analogy. I'm trying to get stuff so that the Americans could understand China. But yes, it feeds. It's this weird back and forth where sometimes you kind of tacitly encourage it. Do you want to? These guys sound nationalistic. Do you want to really go against them? The Marxist guys you're worried about. So they're in this weird dance. But that tacit space can kind of give room for this group gets lifted up and the other, the liberal democratic voices kind of get tamed down, and that starts to skew the discussion.
I can't deny I'm tempted to probe you more on the question of pine needle pollen.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to leave that. We're going to take a new set of questions, a new theme, so let's have someone start a new theme and then get a few that relate to that. Sir?
Yeah, I was wondering if you think that she is going to take that drastic step and use military force to take Taiwan.
Okay, we got some military/Taiwan questions coming up. Are you on that theme?
Not quite.
I'll start you with the next theme. Let's just see if we get anything else that's in that sort of military, strategic. Anyone? Well, you already asked first.
I'll try to get it. So I'm less of a foreign policy person, and that one I don't know the answer to. I think that's a big step. It's very risky. It's also failure. We were talking about sort of different attitudes. I mean, trying to take Taiwan and fail. I mean, sort of like having U.S. military intervention and bad consequences. I mean, you think about issues like in 1895, the Sino-Japanese War goes badly for China, and you get nationalist blowback against that. It's a tricky thing. Like on the one hand, you want to strike a nationalistic tone, but if you screw it up, all that resentment can go different directions. You're like, well, you're not. So it's a dangerous issue, and I just I don't know. I don't know. That's a really complicated one. And then does the military drive you in that direction because they're saying this is a high priority? That's it.
Thanks. Hi, thanks for the talk. I agree with you that on the top, the government is trying to centralize power and destroy all kind of legal institutions. It's going back to the Maoist era. So my question is, do you think Xi is going to gain the same level of public support as Mao did back in the Cultural Revolution? So I'm a little bit suspectful to that point, because during Mao's time, the value commitment that people internalize, all this radical egalitarianism. People don't want to get rich. They want everyone to be equally materially. Like it's almost communism. So, and it's this radical egalitarianism that legitimizes and make Mao's movement so powerful. So I'm wondering, can she garner the same support? Because currently, people in China all wants to get rich, and I wonder how much support she can able to garner through such a movement.
Good question.
The question was in the same vein.
This is really in the same vein. I think that I love your book, I love the writing, I love the theories and the thesis. But I wonder if there isn't a more optimistic note that you can draw, which is that the accumulation of private capital in China in the last 30 years really acts as the ultimate check on an authoritarianism run amok.
So I'll take those two because I think they're both very closely related. And I think you're dead on. I think that's actually, both of those are key obstacles. If you're really thinking about China somehow retrogressing much more severely, I think both of those, the idea of like, well, where do you get that kind of personal charisma, loyalty? Where do you get and the resistance of the pushback of the people in society? And so I'm on board. I'm like, how could we possibly imagine that it would go further? And I'll give you, like this again, I'm starting to go in nightmare scenarios about how this starts to happen. And in response to the first question, I would point out that you're absolutely right, China now very different from before. But also remember at the beginning, sort of 49, early 50s, remember how the party, which was confronted with a very, you got to establish military control over a society that's very diverse. You haven't had a presence in the entire society at large for decades. You had your base areas. But now how do you begin to mobilize Chinese society? And think about the campaigns against landlords. Think about the campaigns where you identify class enemies. Those things in the early 50s are crucial because what you need to do, again, this is not what I want. I think this is good now. But if I'm tactically thinking, you start to radicalize society by finding those splits between groups. And you start to find, look, for the past since 78, we've been accustomed to the idea that the pie in China is growing bigger. Even if you're a migrant worker, your salary maybe slowed down in terms, the 90s didn't go up so much, but it was kind of going up to, so I think your analysis is correct that everyone was like, well, I'm just going to do, what happens when that starts to change? What happens when that economic growth rate, one way or the other, slows down? What happens when you start to have those differences between the winners and losers? And now the pie isn't growing as much. What if you need to start to figure out, do those elderly people keep getting the pension that they're accustomed to? Or do you guys, the younger ones, do you have job opportunities when you go? Now you guys also can, so it's different. But what about those people from third or fourth tier schools? There's some social cleavages in China today. And if you were a person who was needing to stay in power and you were looking for support, might you start to remobilize or look to mobilize some? The answer is, of course, oh no, this couldn't possibly happen because I'm like looking at China's own history, I'm looking at other societies. That can't happen? Really? You can't have somebody start to pit groups of Chinese people one against another? That's where I start to get the nightmare scenario. And the answer about the capital, I think you're correct about the accumulation of capital. I would say that that's also a logical target, just as in the United States and other societies. Once you start to think that there are problems, there are a lot more distinct. I think that wealth gap, if you're also trying to think globally about where the discontent over state policies, whether an authoritarian one-party system or elsewhere plays out, I think that's a logical thing where you could start to begin to go. And I think the anti-corruption campaign is in some ways directed at that. It's like, we're beginning to target. So anyway, I'm with you that hasn't happened yet. But could this happen? I don't know.
I think we have time to just take two more questions. Why don't we take one here? Oh gosh, we'll take three. So one, and then Jack, two, and then three, and then we'll close.
So I noticed you've been paying close attention to Chinese online internet, how people respond to different social problems. You must have noticed that we have a lot of discussion on the constitutional power by President Xi. There were critics, there were people who are saying that we should do this. And one voice coming out of that was it was sort of an emergency response towards this world where there's even more and more strongman politics. And without this concentration of power, it's sort of impossible for us to cope with this current difficulty, for example, the trade war with the US. And I just wonder like how you think of this kind of like comment.
Thank you. I agree with your characterization of the regression of political norms under Xi. I want to push you to talk a little bit about where the norms come from and sort of the why. One of my mentors wrote a book, Logic, Political Reform in China, right? And it argues that the plan and the institutions of economic reforms was not planned sort of all at once, right? It was a response to elite politics and political competition. And so I think one of your comments sort of suggested that the evolutionary nature of these institutions. But then the question is now, with the shifting of the norms, right? Where are the centers of power that might resist, right? The revision of the existing norms that was similar to how, under Deng, the provinces were brought in, right? Playing to the provinces was a political strategy as much as it was a response to Mao era politics. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you for your talk. I kind of want to ask a question regarding a conclusion that a reader might, and that they took your title at face value, that is sort of that China's rise is ending. Because I would argue that sort of, as we've seen on the news recently, a lot of sort of paranoia sort of about China's becoming this powerful in whatever scientific field, industrial field. So like, Xi's, in essence, I want to ask that Xi's sort of regression of sort of more more democratic norms that were partially institutionalized, as you said. Maybe he just wants to sort of weaponize sort of the capabilities that China has developed over these past few decades. And if, in that sense, like, isn't she not just destructive of previous norms, but also constructive of new norms to better sort of fit his agenda?
So I'll think you see the order that I can take that out. Maybe I'll go. Okay. So I think the question you were asking was sort of where did the norms come from in the beginning? And the answer, I think, you can't. People talk about sort of economic planning and stuff. I think it's important to recognize that all of the base of what we've known over the last 30 or 40 years really has been built on the political stability that was engendered by some of the things Deng and others did in the early 80s. I mean, you really are, in post-78, you're moving into an era in which you don't purge the other guys overnight. You have some sort of discussion over policies. You permit, different voices to emerge without labeling them as politically deviant. And that comes about from two things. I think one is the searing experience of the Cultural Revolution. That generation of people in the late 70s and early 80s, they knew how bad it could get. They personally knew how bad it could get, and they're like, we're not going back there. If you look at some of those old dumb speeches where he's talking about law, and he's like, we can't have a system where one guy just says everything and that's the rule. We've got to have discussion. And so it's linked to this idea of we need some kind of institution so this doesn't happen before. And it's also, I think, tied, the other element is, I think you have a different power center. So, Deng and Chen Yun are kind of, it's not just one person at the top, it's actually multiple people who are kind of working. I think the combination of those two things creates a unique moment in the late 70s, 80s that then has continuing resonance going forward that then, creates the conditions for what we've known of the stability over the last 30 or 40 years, those partially institutionalized norms. With respect to the second question about, what do we understand about the breakdown of these norms? The interesting thing is I actually sort of come down, I know the discussion now in China, China is going to be the next biggest, because of the breakdown, China is retrogressing to sort of, it's the next biggest threat to world order. I actually come down in a little bit of a different place because I think at the end of the day, Beijing is more of a threat to China than it is to the rest of the world. I mean, I think that the internal risks of what happened really rebound. Look, I'm not exaggerating that there's, I can go on about stuff they're doing with the diaspora. I can point to the Taiwan issue. But if you're really thinking about sort of the long term, I don't view this as like, the the magic Orwellian 1984 thing that somehow just spreads across the world. I view this as like really political erosion that's starting to eat into the core of China's success. And so the question about like, well, when I say the authoritarian, the rise, I mean it's actually, you know, how the revival is undermining its rise. I look at it as like cannibalizing, eating away at the core things that helped China reach where it is today. And so that's what worries me, is that, and you're saying, well, if I could point to some other institutions that are being born, I'd be happy to do it, but I just keep seeing they're all, it's, you know, party committees are coming back into the joint enterprises. The party is reabsorbing the government. So it's not like there's something new that's being built. It's like devolving to an earlier level. And haven't we seen how this story ends? It doesn't go well. Or China. I mean, that's, I think, look, I can talk about the Taiwan. You're right about Taiwan, but like, it's the people living in China who have to deal with this junk in the long run, and that's not going to. And so then the question about the constitutional, I think the logic of like the re-centralization of power is, it may both be in Xi, and it may also be the institutional factors that push it in this direction. And I think you're right that you get both, you know, some people who sort of live through the Cultural Revolution, who like see this. I was on a panel with a guy like 2 or 3 weeks ago who was like, you know, I was the earliest generation of economic reformers, and I look at this and I'm just like, how is I'm seeing the stuff when I was 22 or 23 that's starting to come back. And he was talking about, you know, turn against marketization, other things, but he was saying this would equally apply to other fields as well. And so you're right about the pushback, you're right about the, you know, people who are voicing alternative views. And I just, right. So I hope that, you know, that gets heard. I hope people understand the risks. But there's a logic to the way this plays out. That's what makes me worried.
Okay, well, thank you all for the terrific questions. Thanks to the Mitchell Center for Democracy for working with our Center for the Study of Contemporary China to host Carl. And please join me now in thanking Carl Minzner for this very provocative and